Moscowitz here. Let me just make sure the mic calls back in. Just flicking around here like crazy. Here he is. Sorry about that, Mike. I'm here flicking so many buttons that I think I flicked the wrong one, and we ended up off the derrick, so to speak. So as I was mentioning, we have the US Open going. And Boston, when we have an event like this in this small city with its old road system that was designed in colonial times, you have the whole city jams up. It happens every September when Boston University comes back, and you have, something like 50,000 people coming in, and all the New Yorkers are lined up on the street, double parked, triple parked, the city just jams. So that's what's going on. That's why I'm late. What's happening with you?
Well, the usual, trying to just a poor country boy trying to make it in a big city.
Yeah,
nothing different.
I want to talk a little bit. I don't know if you're following it, and I'm not following it that religiously, but the January 6th committee hearings. I don't know if you're up on that.
No, the only way I follow it is to watch other people comment on it, because it just seems that it would be totally depressing.
Oh, it is.
That this clown show exists in the hallowed halls of government, so to speak.
But I'm worried that they may be making an impact. I mean, they will admit almost, and commentators on the left are fairly open over the fact that they're just doing this for one reason only. Well, two reasons. The first is to take down Donald Trump and make sure he never runs again. But the second is because this is the only thing they have to try to win or at least preserve a position in the upcoming midterms. They've got nothing else. We've got inflation that is bigger than it's been since 1980. You've got, supply chain shortages. You've got food shortages. You've got baby formula shortages. You've got war in the world. You've got, all this other crap happening, and there's not much. And even they're throwing Biden under the bus. Even the Atlantic magazine just did an article saying that they're not going to support him for another term, which tells you that he's a lame duck and that there's no one else in the wings except one person. And I think we know who that is. And she's getting her hair done, and she's apparently getting all ready. And that is, of course, Crooked Hillary. She'll be the nominee, probably, I predict.
Oh, my word.
But they have this hearing, and they're playing it up. And I think we can't just ignore it. They are trying to criminalize the planning of the contest of 7 states. They're trying to say that this was an attempt to overthrow the election. And I think that it's interesting that one day before, I want to just comment on it because
Sure.
One day before the January 6th hearing, and by the way, that is a hearing that takes place every 4 years, after an election, in which the presidency is certified by delegates. And so this is in the Constitution. One day before that hearing, the New York Times, of all newspapers, published an article, and if you read my book, I draw on it heavily, where they went into it. They said, Democrats, be careful to criticize contesting the elections because it's happened before.
Well, it's happened before a lot.
Yeah, and I get into this in my article. And even recently, the election between Trump and Crooked Hillary, there was a contestation. So it's not new. So there's nothing unconstitutional about it. And they're acting like there was something sinister in, the planning this, and they want to see phone records and emails of people who are discussing this. Yeah, they did it. Of course they discussed it. It was a legitimate plan to try to get to the bottom of whether or not the election had enough improprieties in 7 states that were contesting it, that it would therefore be thrown into a House session. And that Mike Pence, who was the presiding officer of the hearings and who was the vice president of the United States, he had the constitutional responsibility to proceed with these hearings in any state that contested the election. And at the end of that contestation, which should take up to 2 hours, he could then either recognize
That's 2 hours per state.
Per state,
right,
which would have dragged out at least for a couple of days. But then he was in a position, according to the Constitution, and the Constitution is very explicit about this. It says that the president of the assembly has plenary powers, which means absolute powers, to recognize or not recognize the delegation that was sent up by the states. That's not a theory. I mean,
no, that's absolutely true. And let me interrupt here, but because
please,
you know very well that the latest thing going around is the Trump people knew this was illegal to suggest to Mike Pence and so on. I mean, my question to you, as being an observer of this kind of thing, I mean, obviously they know they're lying, but
right,
do they feel that everyone's an idiot? Or at least,
well, that's what worries me. They do think that people are an idiot, and they're trying to smear Trump and those who supported this in the same way that they try to pull off the the phony phone call to the Ukrainian president, right, and the same way they wove this really ugly conspiracy theory that Trump was put in power by Putin because he collaborated, or as they say,
is this kind of the Harry Reid thing? That you just spew whatever lie and whatever sticks, that's great. And of course, he famously replied when he was called on it, the one about Romney, not that I'm a fan of Romney. Well, it worked, didn't it?
Well, that's right. I mean, exactly. I mean, he said this later. Right. It's so unscrupulous, but that's hardball, ugly politics. And that's what they're playing. And my only fear is that it might work. They can push this out there. They've got the whole media backing them. Everybody's on board, and they're just pounding away. They've already had 4 of these. They got 5 more scheduled, and they're just going for the whole hog. And, it shows, I hope that people realize that people like Peter Navarro, Steve Bannon, they haven't responded to subpoenas because they know that their theory is that this committee is not legitimate. And they base that theory on the fact that this is the first time in American history that a congressional committee did not have selected members of the opposition party
correct
in the committee. And the reason that that's important is because by having voices from the other side having their people come up, having their questions raised, it prevents a committee from becoming a political witch hunt, a kind of a kangaroo court. And that's something that has generally been agreed upon by all sides. I mean, that's what kept the McCarthy committee honest in the 1950s. This is what you do. You don't have like a committee made up of only one party so they can parade forth their select witnesses. And this committee is the first time that they don't have that, because the Republicans presented several congressmen who would be selected, including Jim Jordan.
Yeah.
And that Pelosi shut that down and cherry-picked a few people of her own, namely Cheney and that other one. And those people are, they're not going to ask the tough questions. They're totally in the back.
Well, let me ask you this. Could this have been stopped if the Republicans were a little more rigorous about who was a member of the team? I mean, Liz Cheney was
that's right.
Jump. Okay.
Well, what happened? I mean, McCarthy just completely folded his tent and said, fine, well, we're not going to cooperate at all, which is okay. But I think he could have maybe done a little bit more of a strenuous public challenge of this. And there could have been issues made. And I hope that there will be after the election in November, assuming that the Republicans take back the House. But the problem, I mean, look, the last hearing, I didn't see it in its entirety. I saw a bit of it, and I was listening to some commentary on it. But they had a couple of Trump lawyers come up namely this guy, John Eastman, who, and by the way, there were rumors that he is the brother of the late Linda Eastman, who was Paul McCartney's wife. That's not true. Not true. But he
It's a good story.
But he came up and he said he had advised Trump that these hearings were illegal, that he could not do this. He couldn't ask Pence to do this because it was illegal. Now,
which was totally a crock. I mean, why put yourself out on a limb like that?
Well, the point is that, look, I don't doubt that he did say that to Trump. And the other people that they brought forth probably also said it to Trump. But the problem is that when you don't have a balanced committee with the opposition party, you can't have other advisors to Trump, like Giuliani, like Navarro,
right,
who said, no, it is legal. So yeah, sure, he heard both sides, but they're trying to frame this in such a way that they're only bringing up the people who said it was not legal as a way to try to claim that Trump knew that he was doing something illegal.
Well, that was the headline in the Washington Post today.
Yeah.
That Trump knew it was illegal. And of course, I knew that it wasn't, but how many people reading that newspaper? Well, of course, then we go off into how many people read it anyway, you know?
Well, no, it's very influential. And it's not so much, you see, the way that works and the way the New York Times works also is that the actual numbers of readers they have isn't all that great outside of New York City and outside of New York State.
Right.
But they have huge influence because the news departments in every major newspaper in the United States, they do read it and they follow their lead. That's the establishment voice.
So there's more to it than, as Michael Savage used to call it, Upper East Side women with hysterectomies.
Yeah, basically. And you know, to give balance, you have the same thing with the Wall Street Journal, which is slightly right of center. Those two organizations call the shots in terms of what is the public discourse in this country, in the major media. And so you can have some
major
small,
is the major media, though. I mean,
well, that's just it. It is major because of its unspoken power. It's not major in terms of its literal footprint, which isn't even that great. And I think the New York Times is in trouble. I mean, they're shrinking, but they still have that kind of clout because every major newsroom, television, radio, print, digital, they get the New York Times and they follow their lead.
Okay, got it. But have you ever thought about how many people, I mean, actual people, go to other sources?
They do, but they're not the major people. They're not the mainstream. They're people like you and I, you know, in podunk nowhere. I mean, you know what I mean? It's like, you know, there is an alternative media, but it is, and now with the present censorship and shadow banning and algorithm banning, they really seem to have a pretty good clamp.
But then how do you explain the fact that Donald Trump was elected? Because
that was their wake-up call. That was their wake-up call.
Well, wake-up call maybe, but his candidacy was opposed by 150% of the mainstream media. So
but there's a trick there. It was not. This was before the big tech, Facebook. This guy Alam Bakari, the author of Breitbart reporter. He wrote a book. What was it called? Deleted. Yeah. I had him on the show a few times. He gets into this. He says that they did not. It was sort of a shock to the system, and it was a surprise that Trump won because there was still not this kind of control and censorship in, you know, Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and all of the others. But once that happened, they then got together and figured out how to do that. And in my book, I show that there was a meeting actually at Zuckerberg's home. They did a dinner meeting with all these people where they figured out how they were going to do it. And, you know, this is what's happened. So they have that apparatus in place. I don't want to go into too much the 2020 election right now because I've decided that on this particular show, I'm running it on YouTube. So let's.
No, I mean, we better talk about.
We don't have to talk about that right today.
I think there are a lot of people that are seeking out other sources. that aren't Facebook and aren't Twitter.
Yeah, but it's not the mainstream of America. The mainstream of America are people that I know in my family and in my circles who just get their media, they get their news from Lester Holt and from the three,
I find that so hard to believe.
But it's true. They don't have the time to look, they'll look at Newsweek. They don't look at Newsmax. They don't look at far left-wing sources either, by the way. They look at, they get a political feed from Politico on their cell phones. They get the mainstream. This is still, people like you and I, who are not part of the normies, that's right. I mean, that's not the majority of people. Most people are too busy paying 42% of their income in taxes, putting on masks, worrying about, food shortages. They're not paying attention to what's really going on.
Do you mean that there are people that actually sit in front of a television like it was the 1950s with all the commercials and so on and watch Lester Walter Cronkite Holt?
Yes.
While they're having their TV dinner?
Either that, well, that's more people our age, Mike, older people. You can tell by the drug commercials and the Viagra commercials, right? I mean, but younger people, like, in the younger generation, they're getting their news from TikTok and from Facebook and from clips from, liberal sources. They're not looking at Lester Holt, but they're also not looking at what you and I look at. Maybe the closest they may even inch towards something conservative might be, Ben Shapiro or like that professor in Canada. What's his name?
Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, Jordan Peterson. That's about as far conservative as they're going to go.
What about the phenomenon, though, that you go to someone like Ben Shapiro, that's pretty much a gelded conservative. I think you and I can agree on.
Yes, and he's also does not like President Trump, right?
Well, he is. I'm not a real fan. Let's put it that way.
Neither am I.
But what if someone gets the word that, well, maybe I should watch, I think, what is it called, a Daily Wire, and see Shapiro, and then sort of think, maybe I want something a little more edgy. There's going to be some of that human curiosity.
Maybe a small piece. I think most
people
would rather
not. Small as you do, but I think the influence, it's like Twitter. On Twitter, you have 7 people that can make a fuss and bots that can make a fuss, and somehow there's this outsized influence. But I don't know if that were the case, right? If that were the case, and the fact that no matter how bad Biden gets, he's never really condemned in the mainstream media, and yet everybody hates the guy. So how do you explain that? There have to be other.
Oh, that's an interesting question, because he completely tanked within a few months of taking off, and he never really had a bubble. And at this point, I think it's irredeemable. I mean, even the liberal establishment is throwing him under the bus now, trying to see if they can save the ship, by throwing overboard any kind of like ballast.
Well, here's the thing: they're never going to be able to save the ship because what's a polite way of saying their head is too far up their ass? Okay, I mean, they're so committed. You know that this woman, Mexican-born, won that congressional seat in Texas, Republican, was the first Republican representative in that district since 1870.
Wow.
1870.
Incredible.
Okay.
And but the problem, Mike, is that people don't know this. Even Fox News isn't talking about it. That's the point. I mean, they still have this kind of dominant in the media. I know it because I read the Gateway Pundit, right? Which is incredible, or you can listen to Steve Bannon, right? The War Room Pandemic. These are fantastic sources, and by the way, Steve Bannon is huge. I will say that he seems to be breaking breaking through a bit. And I think that's going to help. It's amazing to me that he's still allowed to be on Apple, but he is. And I
I think they're
recommend,
hedging their bets by leaking through a few of them. But what I was to talk about this woman in South Texas.
yeah, Myra Flores.
Was that you'd think it'd be a wake-up call, but it's not for them, because instead of saying, hey, maybe we're wrong about this, and maybe we're wrong about the fact that actual real Hispanic people in the US are not in favor of open borders, which was completely obvious to anyone.
Right.
So instead, the Democratic establishment's attitude is, well, they're just too damn stupid to understand what's good for them. That's
you're right. I mean, they've already come out with articles where they're pulling their hair and saying, how could this be happening? Hispanics are not going to support us. I mean, and they are moving in. And I would also say African Americans, particularly men, are waking up and moving away.
Yeah.
And they're just, I don't know what I hate to think about what they're going to try to do to stop that. I mean, I can guess that there may be an event that could, polarize hatreds and get people riled up.
I think the old playbook it doesn't work anymore, and there's no one with any talent to come up with new ideas. I mean, what I thought was pathetic is one of the reactions to this Flores victory was there some other, let's be honest, House Hispanic Democrat person from South Texas. Oh my, what are we going to do? Because the most important thing in the world is to keep South Texas Democratic. Not that maybe, I'm supposed to be representing the people here rather than representing the party, which was exactly Myra Flores's campaign slogan, that it's time to represent the people, and the people are maybe waking up. Maybe it'll never happen.
I think they are.
Chicago. All right. I don't know how bad Chicago has to get before they stop this 90 plus years of having Democratic mayors. Maybe they think that it's all a fluke. I mean, say what you want about Daley, the city worked.
Exactly. And I mean,
now it's a mess.
There could be a major shock in these big cities. We just saw San Francisco get rid of that scumbag Chesa Bowden, the son of the terrorists.
Kathy,
Kathy Bowden, exactly. And he, because people in San Francisco are tired of stepping on shit, and they're tired of the crime and the fact that he actually went out publicly and stated that he was not going to prosecute people unless they had committed murder and major capital crimes. Now, I understand that, and these are all DAs that are backed by you-know-who, but we're not going to say his name, the Hungarian billionaire, among others. That to go out and publicly state that you're not going to prosecute, that's insane. Maybe don't do it as much, fine. But this is not a virtue. This is not something that you're going to ring up as I'm not going to prosecute people who are breaking into stores and ripping off, 7-Elevens. I mean, this isn't like a virtue. But the fact that he announces this publicly, and the same thing with the guy in New York, it led immediately to criminals saying, oh, good, okay, fine. And they would write in
LA with Gascon, who's also
there's another one
recalled.
And also St. Louis, and there's a couple of others. People just started showing up at Walmart and saying, oh, good. They started piling stuff off the shelf because they knew nothing was going to happen. I mean, doesn't that basically make sense? So I think there's a backlash against that, even in a place like San Francisco and in Los Angeles. These are ultra-liberal bastions. And, that augurs well for the upcoming midterm. I don't know. There's a battle within the Republican Party between what's called the rhinos and the MAGA. And I think that Ultra MAGA, yeah, right, according to Biden. And I think that the MAGA are winning across the board in every race. There's also a battle within the Democratic Party between the old left people, kind of the Mitt Romney crowd. And I know he's a Republican, but you know what I mean, the left wing, the liberals, and the squad, people like AOC.
Well, exactly. The old left representing just the typical commie progressive stuff.
Right.
The new left representing the trans movement and the drag queen story hour. And that's what's going to destroy them. Because there really aren't too many parents that are in favor of drag queen story hour. And
Right.
let's say it, and maybe this will shock some of the viewers here, but I think, unfortunately, a lot of this opening up to this drag queen stuff in the libraries and schools came from extremely misguided white liberal women that dragged their kids into this thing.
You're going to get me in trouble on YouTube, but yes. And by the way, how do they justify this? I mean, why would any school want to particularly bring in drag queens to read nursery rhymes to children? I mean, would they bring in a conservative to read a nursery rhyme? Would they bring in a mother and a father to read a nursery rhyme? I mean, why drag queens? What is the reason? And it seems to be a national phenomenon.
Well, here's the reason. You want to know the reason? I remember, because I'm older,
Yeah.
from the 60s, the head of the SDS made the statement that regardless of what the issue is always the revolution. There you go.
Exactly. Well, that's
So what's
right.
more revolutionary than breaking up families, bringing in these freaks, and telling you that it's supposed to be a virtue?
But, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, this is an attempt to overthrow the authority of the family. I mean, we could take a look at some of the great social, sociologists' works done in the 60s who were very open about this.
Right.
Herbert Marcuse comes to mind. All of those guys from the Frankfurt School.
Trump would say he was a beaut.
Yeah. And, you have, the Faith, what was his name? Faith After Floyd, Leo Pfeffer, I think.
Oh,
That the state, that we have to replace the father-headed family with a state. That was an agenda that was pretty open back then, and that's exactly what this is all about. Same thing with changing pronouns. We don't want to go too far into that because I'm on YouTube right now, so we really have to be careful because you can't talk about that on YouTube. But the point I'm making is that in the actual literal sense, because we know that that's the agenda.
Yeah.
How do they explain it? How do they go to a community, or do they, and say, we want drag queens to read nursery rhymes to children? Here is why. What do they say?
One of the ways you can explain it is that, again, you throw stuff against the wall. And diversity, for example, was proclaimed as a virtue by definition.
But does diversity, I mean, why not, it's like, would you have, why particularly drag queens? Why nursery rhymes to
That's pretty
children?
diverse. Okay.
What is going on with that?
Well, it's an attempt to.
And by the way, if somebody wants to be a drag queen, that's their business. I'm not getting
no, but
into
I don't
that.
have to. That's fine, but I don't have to.
But it's not a place to read
Grammar
nursery
school
rhymes to
library.
children.
Right.
I mean, what is the real? We understand the real purpose, but what are they? How does like a superintendent of school or a principal explain this?
Well, they've been brainwashed. Or let's put it this way: the other thing is, even if they don't believe it, they have to publicly believe it, or else.
I know that, but I just wonder if a reporter went in, and reporters won't do this, of course, because they're totally in the bag, and they interviewed one of them and said, "You're inviting drag queens to come and read nursery rhymes to children and to engage in other things. Why? What would they say?"
Well, they have to fall on to diversity, which is sort of an all-purpose excuse for tolerating any number of awful things.
Well, if they want to be diverse, why not invite a Christian fundamentalist to come in and read a nursery rhyme?
Well, because he's a bigot, that's why.
I see.
So when you start controlling definitions of these words. And again, you talk about the normies and us. Most people are not like us that question authority to this extent. I mean, if someone proclaims diversity as a virtue, my first reaction is, why? Give me some reason why this is such a great thing, okay? In other words, if I'm in an airplane, it's more important that I have a black pilot than have one who's the most qualified. Is that what you're saying? You know,
Right.
But no one thinks about it. And I mean, I had some fun with it when this first started.
Mhm.
When we were living in LA, we were at a party and there were a lot of these liberal people there, and they were talking about diversity. And it was in Beverly Hills. And I said to this woman, and my wife was kind of embarrassed. I said to this woman, "What's the name of your black gynecologist, please?" And that, you know, got silent. And but I'm sure there are a lot of good black gynecologists, but the point is, you can bet your life she didn't have one. And this was a way to embarrass her. So, you know, as the old saying goes, it's not as much fun when the rabbit shoots back, but we haven't been shooting back.
Well, you have to sometimes step out and get in the mud and fight with people, even though it's ugly. And conservatives generally don't like to do that. You know, they kind of are more like clean hands, and they don't do that kind of politics. But that's what it takes sometimes.
I think the reason for that is,
turn the other cheek and all that. I get that. But sometimes you don't play that way. I don't play that way.
well, here's the thing, and you may not like this, but I think one of the problems with the conservative movement is they decided to take Bill Buckley as an exemplar.
Right.
And not only was he a phony, in my humble opinion,
Sure.
but he was very quick to come up with these ridiculous statements like, well, big government is going to be okay for a while so we can fix stuff. And he somehow became the exemplar
He did.
of conservatism. And he was this sort of patrician figure that was doing it so he could be on the other side of things. He got a lot of TV exposure.
Yeah, he was a loyal opposition, and he was very good. I remember he would like lean back in his chair, indubitably, yes. You know, just had this kind of authority of quality about him. He's like one of the last great wasps, right? You know, one of the last of a breed, if you don't mind my saying. Him and Bill Weld here in Massachusetts.
Yeah, the same sort of.
Oh, yes. So, yes, talks like he has marbles in his mouth. You know, it just there's an incredible kind of weird charisma where, you know, with this magnificent leonine head. Oh, wow. And it just, people got sucked into it.
Yeah. So I think that the street fighter aspect of it is starting up now, but for too long, the conservative side has hamstrung itself with this kind of thing.
Right.
And
except then you get a guy like Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Who they don't know what to do with Trump. So they just have to totally stop him because he comes out and he speaks truths, right? I mean, he shoots from the hip, and he always did. And so they have to lie about him, and they have to do this whole routine. And now we're going to have to go through another show trial.
But that's all they've got.
That's what they've done since the day, the minute he stepped off the elevator. You know, it's just it's trying to indict somebody because they're trying to shut him up. They're trying to pull away, you know, they pulled away his presence on Twitter. And, you know, it's and now they're censoring me and everyone else who goes along with that. And I just, you know, I'm confident, but I'm nervous because I understand the kind of power they have and the fact that these are people who have invested in a certain way of thinking that goes way back. I trace it back to the 1912 election of Woodrow Wilson, the first open socialist in America. That was a major sea change. And they've built it.
And he was a socialist and a big racist too.
Oh, well, sure. Oh, yeah. He showed that movie in the White House, and which launched the Ku Klux Klan. And, you know, it's interesting. He was a socialist and a big racist too. Oh, well, sure. Oh, yeah. He showed that movie in the White House, and which launched the Ku Klux Klan. And, you know, it's interesting. He was a socialist and a big racist too. Oh, well, sure. Oh, yeah. He showed that movie in the White House, and which launched the Ku Klux Klan. The thing is that they've built this infrastructure ever since that Steve Bannon accurately calls the administrative state, and they're not going to give it up so easy. You know, when you get a guy like Trump come in who threatens it at its very core, just by being there, by waking up. I mean, you know, I think anyone who wants to understand the Trump movement, you need to read his inaugural address. He lays it out in clear and unequivocal
Well, you
terms.
can see the frowns on all the people when he was laying stuff out. It was unbelievable.
People, I mean, George W. Bush was overheard saying, "This is bullshit," you know, saying this to somebody sitting next to him. So yeah, I mean, they had a complete meltdown. And by the way, we may note that on that August day, when Donald Trump was inaugurated as the duly elected president, you had major insurrection in Washington, not just a little incident. You had people on the street pouring gasoline on people's heads and beating people up. And you had, you know, thugs marching around. And then the next day you had a rally where I think it was Madonna said, "I have fantasies about burning the White House." And you had other people spewing this absolute hate and seditiousness, frankly. I mean, you want to talk insurrection. What, you know, you look at what that was, a day of insurrection in Washington. So, you know, this isn't a, you know, I mean, it's an ongoing thing. Now here we are approaching the midterms, and it's just a very dangerous time for.
Let me ask you about a midterm. What's in Liz Cheney's mind? All right. She's going to be midtermed out. There's no doubt about it.
Well, I mean, I think that Cheney represents the old Bush Cheney, you know.
So she's going to die on that hill?
It seems to be. I mean, she's, you know, that's who put her, that's who she is. That's how she grew up. You know, the warmongers, the internationalists, the socialists with a little bit of phony conservatism on the surface. You know, this is who she is.
So this must be a real difficult moment for her, because every politician wants to get reelected, right? So why doesn't she come out with some sort of road to Damascus speech?
I mean, I suppose I think that she's in it so deep, and it's so obvious that that's who she is, that she's setting herself up. And now I'm hearing rumblings from people that she's going to be the next Republican nominee for president. I mean, you hear, you know, people on the left, of course, and openly, and Democrats. And, you know, she's going to lose. I think her polling is like less than 20% in Wyoming. And some of these other rhinos around the country, and they're backed by people like Karl Rove, who's a washed up political hack.
Oh, Karl Rove and in some cases the Koch brothers.
Well, the Koch brothers, I mean, I mentioned this in my book. Let's not go into it, but they had something to do with influencing the thinking of Vice President Pence. Let's leave it at that, okay? Because we can't talk about that today. But yeah, this is the rhino establishment, and this is an internal war in the Republican Party. Bukowski in Alaska, these people, you watch how much money they're pouring in to their elections. I mean, there's this guy in Illinois who's, you know, these huge money pouring in, unprecedented amounts. I mean, certainly the media is going to get rich from it. Why not? But I'm not sure they're going to win. I mean, there's a prairie fire. There's grassroots. You've got some real people who are just traversing the state. There's another phenomenon that we can't talk about today. Let's just call it the Raffensperger phenomena. All right. I don't want to go into it other than to say that this was a man who was hated by Republicans in Georgia. He's the Secretary of State. We're not going to go into why, and who was way down in the polls. And all of a sudden he wins. I'm going to leave it right there. People can look into it for themselves. There's another one in South Carolina, Nancy Mace, who is enjoying the Raffensperger phenomena.
I think she's going to lose.
Okay, but we can't talk about that today because that's a censored topic on YouTube. And I hope to preserve the little bit of YouTube that I still have. Anyways, Mike, and people can look into it for themselves.
And I hope they do.
Me too. I mean, I hope that people wake up, because we need to have, rather than wokeness, we need a great awakening in this
Now,
country.
the truth will set you free.
Indeed. So what else is happening?
All right. Well, I have, you always ask me what my latest piece
Yeah.
is. And this one is a change of pace. It's called The Strange Case of Nathan Tinstein. And people want to know who the hell was Nathan Tinstein, and it's all described in this piece.
Okay.
So I call it a fable for today.
All right.
So
Can you give me a thumbnail or not? You want
all
to
right, well,
just tease it a little bit.
yeah, Tinstein developed an inferiority complex compared to the other precious metal names. He was always inferior to Goldstein and Silverstein.
I get it.
So he had to formulate a plan of action to increase his standing. And let's say it didn't work out well. But it's the story of Nathan Tinstein, and based on some historical events, believe it or not. Names have been changed to protect the guilty.
Okay. So we can go to your Substack to read that. And where's the Substack?
mdspov.substack.com. And it's funny, the reaction to the Tinstein thing, I was getting comments from people I never hear from.
Mm.
So, and in fact, I was talking to a friend of mine who runs a Catholic evangelistic big website, and he the same thing. He said, "What are you working on?" And I said, "The Strange Case of Nathan Tinstein." And that's where he said, "Who the hell is Nathan Tinstein?" So
yeah, no, this is cool. I'm going to check it out. And I think that in the news right now, the only big bombshell I see coming up is the Supreme Court decision on Roe versus Wade, which could happen any day. My understanding, and this is from Jack Posobiec, who mentioned this, is that the justices are waiting until the school year is over, because some of them have young children in the schools.
oh yeah,
And they're afraid of threats, because you want to talk insurrection. Didn't they just recently uncover a conspiracy to completely, I don't know about firebomb, but to attack the Supreme Court on that day when the decision comes down? This is a major, the fact that this is happening right now in this country, is just horrendous.
the fact that Pelosi didn't want to go forward with that law protecting the Supreme Court justices, and in fact, there are people demonstrating on Kavanaugh's lawn. You're not supposed to do that. All right.
And this guy that showed up with a full armor of weapons.
Yeah.
I think that I just read that the only thing that stopped him was that just as he's approaching the house, he gets a call from his girlfriend who talks him down. That to me is a major threat, and it's ugly. It's just,
well, that's the left. That's the left. It's being exposed. They're all about death, whether it's abortion, killing opponents. Lee Harvey Oswald was not a conservative, let's say that.
Right. Well, that's right. In fact, he was a communist, but that's a whole different subject.
Right.
Yeah, and an interesting one, I may add. So anyways, but great. We'll have people check out your Substack, and that's as Walter Cronkite said, used to say, and that's the way it is. Or what was it that he'd say?
That's the way it is.
Yeah, as if speaking from like he's Moses speaking from the top of Sinai. Those days
really, that was it. The most trusted man in America.
Yes. Oh yeah, that's right. And that was, I think that Douglas Brinkley, his biographer, kind of dropped he blew the whistle on that one by showing how left-wing Cronkite was.
Well, right, but the trouble is that came out years later.
Yeah. Again, years later, and it's already
in the know knew his
They
history,
knew this.
but most people, let's be honest, didn't. And
That's right. And so wasn't Edward R. Murrow, for that matter.
oh, well, they all were.
Yeah. So
that
that's
was the
weird.
whole thing with Paley. I mean, they were all cut from the cloth. And, that's changing, I think, a little bit. Now that there's competition, even CNN seems to be purging.
Well, they're getting rid of what's his name, the potato head. That's
Stelter.
Yeah, Stelter. Or that's MSNBC. I'm sorry.
No, Stelter's on CNN.
Oh, he is on CNN. Yeah.
Reliable sources.
Yes, indeed. Okay.
All right.
And once in a while, they venture out into the real world, like that. They spoke at a symposium at the University of Chicago, figuring there's a safe venue, and this young kid stands up. You've seen the video, right?
Oh, yeah.
And he completely eviscerated them right in public. So they went back in their hole.
Well, that's happened a number of times.
Well, I think it's happening every time they step out into the real world.
Yeah, when they go to the real world, they get their feelings.
Suddenly somebody kicks their ass, and that's where we are. So anyway, Mike, I'll talk to you next week.
Sounds good.
Thanks for joining me as always. Excellent.
And we will
keep on